Hello everyone, this is Xinfu from China University of Geoscience. It's my pleasure to present our work recently published in GIC Special Paper 52 about Chinese IOCG, IOA, and skarn deposits. This chapter was collaborated with Huayong and Nian Dang from Chinese Academy of Science and Mei Fu from University of Hong Kong. Since I do not have enough time to present the whole chapter, I will only focus on the linkage between IOA and skarn iron deposit in eastern China, which is also the subject of the PhD project of Li Ping. Just as Louise talked earlier, she proposed the concept of the iron oxide and alkali calcic alteration ore system. I like this idea. It provides a frame for us to link those different types of deposits using the phases of hydrothermal alteration. Among them, the relationship among IOCG, IOA, and skarn deposits are most important for understanding such an ore system. However, this concept was challenged by recent studies for IOA deposits, which has been a controversial deposit for decades, except for the models of magmatic hydrothermal fluid replacements. Many researchers have advocated that a magmatic origin for IOA deposit, which can be either by immiscible iron oxide melt or by a recent model of iron-rich carbonate sulfate melt. For example, in these two papers published in Geology, both the authors suggested that the magnetite was precipitated in magmatic processes. Then, magnetite grains were floated by hydrothermal bubbles or overprinted by late-stage hydrothermal fluids. They use a magmatic model of magnetite, mainly because of magnetite show geochemical affinities to those of igneous rocks. For example, the iron and oxygen isotopes are in the same range of the igneous magnetite. However, such a geochemical interpretation is not consistent with the field evidence that apatization in most cases predated the precipitation of the iron oxide ore bodies. Recently, Baran et al. Proposed a revised magmatic model. They identified many carbonate sulfate melt inclusions that can be coexisted with fluid inclusions in some IOA deposits in US. They hence suggest that iron ore bodies were formed from iron-rich carbonate sulfate melts, which were produced by the assimilation and anataxis of evaporite-bearing carbonate during magma intrusion. However, we still need to ask, where is the source of the iron, and are these carbonate sulfate melts commonly present in IOA systems? In this study, we will focus on the IOA deposits in eastern China. These deposits are located in several regions along the Yangtze River, and in most cases, the IOA deposits are associated with the iron deposit in some area. Let's have a look at the typical deposit in Linwu volcanic basin. All the deposits are hosted within the Olecretaceous intermediate volcanic rocks and are spatially associated with about 130 million years old dioritic intrusions, and almost all the deposits have the same age as the intrusion. Using the Warsan deposit as an example, ore bodies are mainly hosted along the contact between volcanic rocks and the dioritic intrusion. In this photo, you can see a roughly rounded open pit, which represents the shape of the ore body. In the upper part of the ore body, it was extensively brecciated and has a thick zone of albertization. When we mapped at this open pit, we can find such a gradual change of alteration phases. Here is the relatively fresh, intrusive rocks with weak albertization, moving to strongly albertized rocks, to sodium-calcium altered rocks, and finally calcium-sodium-iron-rich altered rocks. Such alteration phases are also observed in the breccias. The fragments of the breccia were strongly albertized. They are cemented by magnetite or intruded by veins of magnetite, apatite, and actinolite. These field photos can clearly show that magnetite was precipitated after the brecciation of the strongly albertized country rock. In other words, the extensive albertization should be earlier. In these disseminated iron oxide ores, you can see the texture of the diorite was still kept. However, iron oxide have replaced the previous silicate minerals and lead to gradual enrichment of iron. So, based on these observations, we can conclude that magnetite post-dated albertization and are roughly contemporaneous with apatite and actinolite. It suggests that hydrothermal metasomatium plays a very important role in the precipitation of iron oxide. If we examine the magnetite from these typical replacement ores, the fresh magnetite grains are enriched in titanium and show exolution textures of ilmenite. Such magnetite were previously interpreted to be magmatic origin. However, based on the above textures, we can see clearly that they were formed by hydrothermal replacement. So we combined the magnetite data with titanium from the porphyry copper deposit IOCG and IOA deposit, as well as the typical magmatic deposit worldwide. We found this magnetite from IOA deposit are the same as those titanium magnetite from porphyry copper deposit and IOCG deposit, but are different from igneous magnetite. It implies that this titanium magnetite in IOA deposit likely formed through a mechanism similar to porphyry copper deposit and IOCG deposit. Moreover, some magnetite grains have been metasomatized and show core rim textures, which are typical of copper dissolution and reprecipitation textures. The newly formed magnetite contains much low titanium content. The thermometer calculation suggests that the primary magnetite was precipitated at a very high temperature and then was metasomatized by relatively cool fluids during the evolution of the hydrothermal system. Such a metasomatism can also explain the large variation of titanium or magnetite in IOA deposit worldwide. Such an interpretation is also confirmed by similar CDRP textures in apatite. The primary apatite contains very high salinity fluid inclusions with homogenization temperature up to 600 to 800 Celsius degree, whereas the metasomatized apatite have fluid inclusions with much low temperature and low salinities. Such high salinity and high temperature fluid inclusions have been previously reported in garnet and diopside in this deposit. Except for minor anhydride, there are also many salts in these high salinity fluid inclusions. And occasionally, you can see the coexistence of these high salinity inclusions and the vapor phases inclusions. It implies that fluid boring may be responsible for the formation of such high salinity inclusions. Vantigny analyzed the composition of such inclusions using IOA acid mass. You can see from here they contain very high chlorine and sodium, indicated that a major component of highlight. So I would like to term these high salinity inclusions as hydrocyanide liquids, as suggested by Jim Webster. He defined the hydrocyanide liquid containing above 25% chlorine and can be used for different terms. It represents the most chlorine-enriched volatile phases separated from magmas. So I would like to cite this great book published in Chinese in 1978. This author termed the IOA deposit as diuretic porphyry iron deposit, a concept very similar to porphyry copper deposit. It suggests that high-temperature magmatic hydrothermal fluid were exhausted from the subvolcanic intrusions, which form the typical IOA ore bodies at the contact of the volcanic rocks, and possibly it can also form locally skarn ore bodies within the carbonate country rocks. Therefore, the deposits have characteristic zonation from ionization to high temperature calcium iron alteration to low temperature calcium magnesium alteration. We hence suggest that IOA deposits were formed from hydrocyanide liquid exhausted from a shallow magma chamber. Contamination of evaporite was likely happened during the magma chamber, which facilitated the unmixing of the hydrocyanide liquid. Some deposits can also be formed in the same setting if the country rocks were carbonate. I would like to use the Wanbaoshan deposit as an example to demonstrate the potential association between IOA and the skarn deposit. This deposit was located in the western part of the metallogenic belt. In this region, skarn iron deposits are more common, while IOA deposits are relatively rare. However, in the Wanbaoshan deposit, there is a skarn ore body in the upper part and the IOA deposit in the deeper part. Both ore bodies are largely confined within the breccia body. Here are the typical samples from the two types of ore bodies. You can see totally different mineral assemblages. Magnetite from the IOA ores contains titanium much higher than those in skarn ores, implies that they formed at a higher temperature. Therefore, Hu et al. Proposed a very interesting model that earlier immiscible magmatic hydrothermal fluid induced the brecciation of country rocks and the precipitation of IOA ores in the deep part. After the ore fluid cools and interacted with the country rocks, they form the skarn ore bodies. So, make a summary of my talk. IOA deposits in eastern China have pre or apatization and alteration zonation. It can be associated with skarn iron deposit. Both types of the deposit share many similarities in terms of hydrothermal alteration, but IOA ore bodies formed at a higher temperature than iron skarn. IOA deposit was precipitated from high-temperature, iron-rich hydrocyanide liquid. They were evolved from the subvolcanic intrusions. At last, I would like to thank my colleagues, particularly for Louis, who spent enormous time to edit the special paper and organize the webinar. Thanks very much for your attention.